Over the course of the last 90 years, we have grown so accustomed and used to films that told us their narratives through spoken language or other means regarding sound. But before this became the norm, the era of silent films reigned supreme with a seemingly infinite number of imaginative films in which sound was lacking. Such films retained a number of distinct qualities, including the actors themselves. Since actors in the silent era of film were deprived of being able to speak to the audience directly, they instead used exaggerated physical movements, often eccentric and delightfully yet intentionally bizarre makeup, and overt visual displays of emotion to convey storytelling to the viewer. This, coupled with the usage of stunning cinematography and camera tricks, enabled the silent films to be able to tell a story without sound, and often without a large number of title cards as well. Silent film was a whole art form in itself, in which it allowed for the audience to use their imagination to fill in the blanks as a substitute for sound. One of the most effective and fascinating types of silent cinema is that of silent horror films. Films that are equally as seminal and significant as they are downright chilling and even disturbing at times. However, I would argue that silent horror films are an especially riveting place to start for any newcomer that may want to look into the horror genre or silent cinema as a whole. So today, I present what I consider to be the top 13 silent horror films of all time. Number 13. The Haunted Castle, 1896. Starting off with the very first horror film ever made, The Haunted Castle begins with a bat flying into a castle only for it to immediately transform into the devil. The devil wanders about, summoning a cauldron as well as bizarre specters on the castle floor. Soon, a castle guard encounters the spectacles of the supernatural and does battle with the devil, only to ultimately defeat Satan with a large crucifix. I had actually mentioned this film in my Origins of the Horror genre video, though it simply deserves another mention. The historic 3-minute horror film was directed by the legendary George Méliès, who would later direct the first science fiction film ever made entitled A Trip to the Moon in 1902. Méliès's true intention for The Haunted Castle was to make the film comedic rather than frightening, as he sought to amuse people. Yet, since it is the first horror film ever made, warrants it a watch, as this is a fascinating piece of cinematic history. Number 12. The Monster, 1925. An incredibly significant and seminal silent horror film. The Monster can safely be regarded as the origin of both the mad scientist genre and the old dark house genre that would take the horror film by storm, at least for the next few decades following the film's release. A private detective named Johnny Goodlittle investigates a missing persons case which leads him to an allegedly abandoned asylum. However, unbeknownst to him, the asylum is occupied by the deranged Dr. Ziska, a mad scientist who works to fulfill his sinister plan of transfusing souls from one body to the next. Soon, the private detective and his love interest find themselves in the grip of Dr. Ziska, and a world of madness ensues. The highlight of the film is undoubtedly Lon Chaney as Dr. Ziska, who gives an incredibly impressive yet cheesy performance which serves as the precursor to future mad scientists in cinema. Chaney was the first horror actor of all time, and the largest horror star of the 1920s, who usually portrayed roles involving heavy makeup in which he would apply himself, earning the name the Man of a Thousand Faces. Since the film features the classic depiction of an exaggerated mad scientist, it is at least worth a recommend to the most hardcore of horror fans. Number 11. A Page of Madness, 1926. Arguably the strangest of the silent horror film catalog, this Japanese film revolves around a man who decides to gain employment as a janitor at a mental institution to be near his wife, who is presently institutionalized. However, the film's use of sharp camera tricks, superimpositions, offbeat and disturbing imagery, as well as the total lack of title cards, thrusts the viewer into a mental state akin to experiencing a nightmare. The true horror of the film unleashes when the different mental patients dance and wander around the institution wearing traditional Japanese masks, which makes for an especially creepy resolution. Number 10. The Bat, 1926. Despite being one of the inspirations for Batman, the Bat barely mirrors his comic book spawn, but rather a character rooted in gothic horror more similar to future horror icons. Directed by Roland West, who even directed The Monster a year prior and would later remake The Bat in 1933 as The Bat Whispers, the plot centers around a criminal who dresses up like a bat and runs around a mansion attempting to scare away and ultimately murder the mansion attendees inside to retrieve the money which used to belong to a prominent banker that since passed away. The classic murder mystery formula at its finest. What I love about this seemingly obscure horror villain is that he looks freakishly weird. And even the bat signal makes an appearance, but instead of the police using it as a signal for Batman, The bat uses it to petrify his victims before murdering them. Number 9. The Hunchback of Notre Dame, 1923. Adapted from the classic piece of literature of the same name by Victor Hugo, The Hunchback of Notre Dame is a Titanic of silent horror cinema. Yet the film is more tragic than frightening. A hunchback named Quasimodo lurks the vast Gothic halls of the Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris and ridicules the population of Paris in the process. However, he is one day tasked by the evil Jahan, a corrupt figure that wields complete control over Quasimodo, with capturing a gypsy named Esmeralda, only to be framed and punished. Soon, Quasimodo is then punished, yet different perils and challenges emerge when Esmeralda herself is framed for murder. As violence between the poor and downtrodden and the aristocracy unfold in the streets of Paris due to Esmeralda's framing and death sentence, Quasimodo saves Esmeralda, only for a thrilling conclusion to ensue. The Hunchback of Notre Dame from 1923 again features Lon Chaney, except this time with his usual heavy makeup, which shocked audiences at the time. Chaney's acrobatic skills as Quasimodo were impressive, and he insisted on doing his own stunts for the film, as well as his own makeup, which he always did for every film he starred in. The costuming, set design, and lavish appearance provide the film a breathtaking aura, as well as a wild and exaggerated performance that will forever stand the test of time. Number 8. The Phantom Carriage, 1921. A masterpiece of early Scandinavian filmmaking. The Phantom Carriage derives from an old Nordic legend that states that the last sinner who dies in a year will be damned to don a long black cloak and ride a carriage throughout the whole subsequent year, collecting the souls of all those that had passed. Whether they be family members, friends, or acquaintances, all souls must be collected. David Holm, a bibulous drunkard that retells the story to his friends in a graveyard, happens to be the poor sinful soul that perishes last just before the conclusion of the year on New Year's Eve. To his detriment, David is found by the carriage-driving spectre and is forced to dwell in his miserable, wasted life. The film holds a haunting quality which enables it to be one of the most ghostly silent horror films of all time. The dim lighting makes the film perfect to watch on a quiet, rainy evening. Number 7. Frankenstein 1910. We all know that arguably the most famous movie monster of all time is Frankenstein's monster. And while most people are aware of the 1931 Boris Karloff Universal classic, its sequels, as well as the iconic makeup by Jack Pierce, few might be shocked by the fact that there is an even earlier adaptation of Mary Shelley's famous novel. In 1910, the Thomas Edison-owned Edison Film Studio in New Jersey produced their own adaptation simply titled Frankenstein. In this film, Dr. Frankenstein creates the monster by throwing portions of chemicals and substances into a cauldron, creating a monster which looks very bizarre for its time. The freakish design is worlds away from the more iconic Jack Pierce makeup, yet still retains its own ghoulish charm. Despite being only roughly 13 minutes long, the film offers a great deal of substance, such as this neat sequence in which Dr. Frankenstein stumbles upon the reflection of his monster's creation in the mirror, symbolic of how he is a monster himself. Interestingly enough, this film was considered lost for quite some time, but thankfully we now have it massively available for all to see. Number 6. Dante's Inferno, 1911. 1911's Dante's Inferno is not only one of the most significant silent horror films ever made, but also one of the most seminal and important films ever made as a whole. A film production that was the most vast and expensive for its time, so much so the project enlisted the participation of 3 different film directors. Dante's Inferno is loosely based off of the world-famous Divine Comedy poem, which revolves around a poet by the name of Dante seeing the light of salvation on the summit of a mountain, and descends into Inferno, or Hell, in order to reach paradise. Dante is led by Virgil, who takes Dante through an entire Inferno. Dante meets many kinds of sinners, some of which are people he knew, and comes witness to what the sinners will now have to experience for their past sins. Finally, after literally going through hell itself, they come face to face with Satan, who is seen chewing on a body. This scene alone actually gave me many chills when I first watched the film alone in a dark room. The film's uniqueness is enough to warrant it standing the test of time. Number 5. The Golem, 1920. Due to the overarching fear of government persecution of the Jewish people of Prague, a mystical rabbi constructs a mysterious monster out of clay known as the Golem, to defend the Jewish population from any government marginalization and imprisonment. The Golem is a monster from Jewish mythology that is formed either through clay or mud to defend the people of Judaism from evil. However, The Golem from 1920 details the monster initially being obedient, yet soon goes on a rampage as he is possessed by the evil spirit Astaroth. The monster was actually played by the writer and director himself named Paul Wegener, who does a swell job that undoubtedly inspired Boris Karloff as Frankenstein's monster in the future Universal films. The film belongs to a trilogy with 2 more films that are unfortunately lost, yet the distorted architecture and painted shadows gives the film a dreamlike state, as it is a product of an art movement known as German Expressionism, where such shapes and objects are prevalent. The film remains a masterpiece of German Expressionism and belongs to the world's first horror trilogy. Number 4. Haxin, Witchcraft Through the Ages, 1922. This documentary-style silent film pushed the boundaries for 1922 with its focus on the topic of witchcraft, Satan, sin, and other risque and morbid topics for the time. The film is a collection of vignettes providing insight into witchcraft, as well as mass hysteria, a common fixture in world history. Due to the almost anthology-type format of the film, the pseudo-documentary-style feature film features a less-than-linear plot, which gives the film a more haunting quality. In one scene, a group of witches even place the corpse of a baby inside of a little cauldron, and depictions of demons occupy most of the film's frames and scenes as a whole. Another highlight of the film is its presentation of archaic and obsolete astronomical concepts, such as how the universe was created according to obsolete thought and pagan belief. A very revolutionary, creepy, and simply interesting film. The film was a Swedish and Danish production, as well as the most major production to come out of Scandinavia at the time. The film has been recut and re-edited numerous times, yet the creepiness of the film never eroded, regardless of the number of edits. Number 3. The Phantom of the Opera, 1925. The third and final Lon Chaney film on this list, The Phantom of the Opera is one of the most significant and famous silent horror films for a plethora of reasons. But no reason is as vital as that of Lon Chaney himself, who steals the show as the Phantom Eric, a reclusive ghostly phantom that secretly controls the Paris Opera House behind the scenes. However, the Phantom's infatuation and love for a popular opera singer named Christine proves to be his undoing as he vows to take revenge on all those that have wronged him, all the while trying to take Christine for himself. Chaney's performance of the Phantom is absolutely noteworthy, largely in part due to the fact that, like Quasimodo, he did his own Phantom makeup, and impressively gave such a ghoulish performance. One neat piece of trivia about the film is in the scene in which Christine takes the Phantom's mask off for the first time, revealing his face to the audience for the first time. The actress that played Christine, Mary Philbin, was unaware of how Chaney actually looked beneath his mask, and was genuinely frightened when she saw his face as a result. True horror. Number 2. The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, 1920. Easily the most influential horror film of all time, The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari revolves around a patient in a mental institution recounting the tale of Caligari, a crazed doctor who controls the sleepwalking monster Caesar to do his evil bidding. Dr. Caligari claims that Caesar, the sleepwalking man whom he controls, can see into the future as Caesar eerily remarks that certain people will die prior to their actual deaths that do occur in the small German town. Caligari instructs Caesar to kill those whom he despises and vows to take vengeance on, which raises a fascinating moral question of whether Caesar should even be guilty of the murders he commits, as Caligari is the one actually controlling him. Yet Caesar's downfall comes when he falls in love with a woman, which spirals Caligari's forced control into failure and ineffectiveness. This Beauty and Beast trope would be seen later in films such as King Kong or The Creature from the Black Lagoon. Caligari, like the Golem, is an apex example of the German Expressionist art style movement, in which shadows are distorted, windows are misshapen, and houses look surrealistic, making the film retain a dreamlike quality, as these listed qualities are found elsewhere in the German Expressionist movement. The German Expressionism also provides the film's strength, as it substantiates the fact that the film is being retold by a crazed narrator. And now, here are some honorable mentions of other noteworthy silent horror films. Number 1. Nosferatu, A Symphony of Horror, 1922. One of the creepiest films of all time, Nosferatu is said to be the earliest existing Dracula film. However, unable to get the rights from Bram Stoker's widow, director F.W. Murnau still managed to go ahead with his dream of adapting Bram Stoker's legendary Dracula novel onto the silver screen, by altering the source material in which Nosferatu would be adapted from. One example in which Murnau changed his product to avoid copyright is by changing the vampire's name to Count Orlok as opposed to Count Dracula. Pursuant to the plot, Count Orlok summons real estate official Thomas Hutter to his residence in Transylvania, as Hutter is interested in working with Orlok to enable him to purchase an estate next to Hutter's own residence, which he shares with his wife. Ellen, Hutter's wife, is ultimately at risk from becoming an undead partner for Orlok, as she falls into the hands of Count Orlok himself. I believe this film is perhaps the creepiest film on this list, and if you haven't seen the film, you most definitely have probably seen stills or some footage. Though, thankfully, Dracula did receive the proper cinematic treatment as a full-fledged and more faithful adaptation by Universal in 1931, with the film starring Bela Lugosi as the iconic Dracula. In conclusion, silent horror films are some of the creepiest horror films ever made simply due to how distant we are from them. Much of the time, there are few actors we can connect the films to, and with the vintage, antique essence held by the films, the earliest of horror films must never be forgotten or neglected, but remembered, watched, and cherished. Since not only are they practically creepy, often disturbing, and extremely relevant even today, but they retain a largely poetic mystique which makes them perfect to delve into when the night gets quiet and the ghoulish, exaggerated faces inch closer to you from your TV screen as you are all alone in the dark.